The Electorate of Brandenburg, Prussia. The next major event in the history of Brandenburg, Prussia was the 30 Years' War. The electors of Brandenburg did not really want to get involved in the 30 Years' War. They just didn't think it was really their fight, being both Calvinist and Lutheran, and just not really quite seeing how it involved them. However, they were forced into it by Gustavus Adolphus. You might remember Gustavus Adolphus, the great champion of Protestantism in the 30 Years' War. Here's the problem. Gustavus Adolphus's wife was the sister of George William, the Elector of Brandenburg. So Gustavus Adolphus kind of forced George William to join the war on the Swedish side, and he had to give the Swedes permission to cross through his territory. Unfortunately, that made Albrecht von Wallenstein, the champion of the Catholic side, very angry, and they came in and sacked Prussia and destroyed several cities. In Brandenburg. Then later, after the Battle of Nordlingen, when Gustavus Adolphus was already dead, the George William switched to the imperial side, and then the Protestants came and destroyed many cities in Brandenburg. In the end, Brandenburg suffered the most in the 30 Years' War. It lost about 50% of its population, 5,000 villages were destroyed, several castles, and several other major fixtures, and it was just devastating for them. There's a reason for this. We'll get to that on the next slide. It was George William's son, Frederick William the Great Elector. That's a name to know. Frederick William the Great Elector. That's his nickname. The Great Elector, who had the task of rebuilding Brandenburg after the end of the 30 Years' War. And one of the things he realized is that Brandenburg has no natural boundaries. Brandenburg has no natural boundaries. So in the process of rebuilding, he decided it's going to have to be known for its military. He decides to pour a lot of resources into building up a military. In the 30 Years' War, he had only about 5,000 troops, most of them mercenaries, most of them Landsknechte, or Landsknechte, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. That is basically the German counterparts to the Swiss pikemen. They were kind of the replacement of the Swiss pikemen. But now he decided to have his own standing army of 40,000 troops. This, of course, required a tremendous amount of energy and preparation, and he created a whole new bureaucracy just to go with this new army. For example, the most famous thing he did was he established the General War Commissariat. This is going to be one of the major institutions, not only of Brandenburg, Prussia, but of Europe in general. It's it basically is a very efficient bureaucracy whose only job is to take care of the Prussian army, and it kind of becomes a nation unto itself. In the future Prussia, the army is famous for its kind of independence and its almost separate status, its parallel nation status. And it starts here. It kind of starts here with the General War Commissariat established by Frederick William, the Great Elector. This is a picture right here of the new army that he's building, and that's going to become a standing army. In other words, Frederick William is responsible for starting Prussia on this path to military supremacy that it will eventually become famous for. Now, to pay for all this, Frederick William also thinks of new ways to make money. He basically applies mercantilist principles and applies, basically that, which is what everybody's doing at this time. But he basically employs that economy, and it basically works. He gets a lot of money into Prussia, but also he explicitly welcomes Calvinists to Brandenburg, Prussia, especially after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in France, when Louis XIV told the Huguenots they were no longer welcome in France. It was he that specifically welcomed Calvinists into Brandenburg, Prussia, in order to boost the economy. You all remember, he's one of those people that recognizes that Calvinists are good for business. He welcomes the Calvinists from France after 1685 into Brandenburg, Prussia. It was also against Louis XIV that this new Prussian army saw its first action. The Prussian army became part of the Franco-Dutch War. In that war, they joined the alliance against Louis XIV. That is, they joined the Dutch, led by William, as in William and Mary, but right now he's just stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. they joined the Holy Roman Empire in the person of Leopold I, and of course Spain in the person of Charles II. The Allies lost that war, but soon they would try again. They would have another chance to fight Louis XIV in the War of the Spanish Succession. Let me write that down. There's also, just give me 1 second, the War of the Spanish Succession. In that war, you all remember the reason for it. Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg, died without an heir. By this point, William was now King of England, so he's going to be out of the picture briefly for our purposes right now. But in this war, basically, Prussia was also involved, although not Frederick William himself. It would be his son, Frederick III, who would take the part of Prussia in this war. Now, here's the thing. This is the war that involved the Grand Alliance. And everybody wanted Brandenburg, Prussia to be part of this Grand Alliance. But Frederick III here asked for a condition from the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. He asked Leopold, he basically said, hey Leopold, if I fight with you against Louis XIV, please allow Prussia to become a kingdom. Let me write his name down here. This is Frederick III. Now Leopold desperately wanted the help of Brandenburg, Prussia in this war, so basically he consented. And the argument was very simple. Since Prussia was not part of the Holy Roman Empire, they could call it a Kingdom of Prussia, since effectively the Elector of Brandenburg was also the monarch of the Duchy of Prussia. So they basically, the argument that Frederick used was, in virtue of that part, he has the right to be called a king. Inside the emperor doesn't have that right, because inside the Holy Roman Empire, only the Kingdom of Bohemia was allowed to take the title of king. Everything else inside the Holy Roman Empire was not allowed to become a kingdom. But in virtue of Prussia, there could be a kingdom. Now here's the other problem, though. He's only got half of Prussia. Poland's got the other half. Because of that, he got a rather complicated title. Frederick III, the Elector of Brandenburg, turned into Frederick I, King in Prussia. And that's how Brandenburg, Prussia went from being just an electorate to now a kingdom, but the kingdom in Prussia, not a kingdom of Prussia. Prussia because only Bohemia is allowed to be called a kingdom, so you have to pick something outside the Holy Roman Empire. In Prussia, because they don't have all of Prussia, they only have the eastern half. West Prussia is still firmly in the hands of the Polish. But thus begins the kingdom in Prussia, or the kingdom in Prussia. By the way, just a note on the bird here. The middle there says Fredericus Rex. That just means Frederick the King, since Frederick I became the first king in Prussia. When it comes to the kingdom in Prussia, Frederick I was not particularly famous. All he did was get the thing started. The major person that makes the kingdom in Prussia a rising power is this man right here, his son, Frederick William I. The Soldier King. You can probably guess why he was called that. Most of his time was spent in promoting the army. It's he that decided that Prussia is going to be the best military power in the 17th century. You can see that here, basically. Here is the military ensign of the Prussian army that basically starts at this time. And how did he do this, basically? Lots and lots of drilling. First of all, he raised the army to about 80,000. We're up to about 80,000 troops, about doubling the size. But also just constant drilling. He engaged his men in constant drills, constant new tactics, and constant inspections. Remember, the Prussian army is almost like a state unto itself, and it had a whole bureaucracy that just was ordered to its making it into a well-oiled machine. You can see some pictures here of the Prussian infantry right here, and then some more pictures of the Prussian cavalry right here. You get the idea. These are actual manuals from the time showing the results of various inspections, but it gives you a good picture of how much energy he put into the different units of the Prussian army. Speaking of units, one of his more interesting units was the Potsdam Grenadiers. The Potsdam Grenadiers was a unit of giants, literally of giants, people that were taller than normal, that he literally found and kidnapped from all over Europe to be in this strange bodyguard that consisted of giants. Here's another picture of one right here. Here's a Potsdam Grenadier right here. These were all people that were considered tall for their time, but even tall by our standards. Some of them, I think, reached up to 7 feet tall, people with gigantism. You can kind of tell the gigantism because it's also the really large hands. This is also the time that it begins to take on its own style. A lot of our images, for instance, of the Prussian army come from this time. You can even see that here in my daughter's Nutcracker, where you can see the Prussian soldier with the various uniform elements, including the famous Prussian blue. Blue became the uniform of most of the infantry of the Prussian army, and even its own color that they invented themselves, the Prussian blue. Other various identifiably Prussian or even German things come from his time. For example, the goose step. He trains his army in all their drills in the goose step. That begins at this time. That style of marching that looks like, well, a goose, I guess, without bending the knee. Another thing is he had the best infantry, these guys were the best riflers of Europe at the time. They could fire 6 shots in a minute, which was double the size, even triple, 6 shots in a minute. This was triple the size that anybody else could fire at this time. Everybody else could do only 1 or 2 in a minute. So they really were the best army. Another thing Frederick William emphasized were the Prussian virtues. These typically kind of, we associate them with Germany, but they back then associated them with Protestantism, these typical duty-bound virtues that were supposed to mark the Prussian soldier. Virtues such as courage, like Mut, just give me a second, punctuality, Pünktlichkeit. These things that we think of as typically German. Another one, orderliness, Ordnungssinn. Or, just give me a second, the sense of duty, Pflichtbewusstsein. Etc., etc., etc. You get the basic idea. Those things we normally think of. Sense of justice, Gerechtigkeitssinn. Sense of sincerity, Aufrichtigkeit. Straightness or straightforwardness, Geradlinigkeit. Geradlinigkeit. Subordination, Unterordnung. Toughness, Härte. Industriousness or diligence, Fleiß. Loyalty, Treue. All these various Prussian virtues kind of go back to Frederick William, the soldier king. Frederick William definitely set the stage for Prussia to be the best army ever, an army that his heir would inherit. Unfortunately, he did not have as much success at least by his standards, in the raising of his heir. The heir, of course, was his son, whose name also was just Frederick, not Frederick William, but just Frederick. Here you can see a picture of little Frederick following according to his father's wishes, carrying a spear. It's supposed to make him look like he's being trained in the art of war. But unfortunately, that's not at all what Frederick was interested in. Frederick William wanted his son to be raised basically to know 2 things, war and religion. And by religion, that means Calvinism. Ironically, little Frederick didn't really seem to like religion much, except in one area. His father specifically forbade teaching predestination to little Frederick because he himself thought he was, Frederick William, the dad, thought that he was one of the damned, so he didn't want Frederick to worry about himself being damned, so he specifically told his teachers not to teach Frederick about predestination. But interestingly, that's exactly the one doctrine of Calvinism that Frederick seemed to imbibe. Frederick ultimately is going to be a deist, someone who believes that God's there but doesn't really do anything in human affairs. Frederick himself, that was what his dad wanted. He wanted one religion, but Frederick himself was more interested in poetry, in the classics, in what else? In music, all these other things, and of course philosophy. He ate up the work of the enlightened philosophers that were making their way into Prussia. Frederick was, of course, educated in French. He was educated by French Huguenots. The Huguenots taught him. All these French people that are moving into Prussia ever since Frederick William, the Great Elector. Now, eventually, Frederick found life at home a little bit too hard. He didn't really get along with his dad, and he actually tried to run away. When he was a little bit older, here's a picture of him older now, that, I guess almost, probably a little around teenage years, Frederick. He tried to run away to the country of his mother. His mother was Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, but the daughter of King George I of England. So Frederick wanted to run away with England with his childhood friend, Hans Hermann von Katte. The one problem with this is they were both technically members of the army, and for them to both run away to England would be desertion. And they were caught. They were caught at the border of Brandenburg. Their father caught them, gave them a really good talking to, pointed out that they really both should be executed for desertion. But Frederick William couldn't bring himself to execute his own son, so instead he just executed Hans Hermann von Katte. But to make sure his son got punished, he forced his son to watch the execution from the window. You might be thinking, well, why is Frederick watching? Why can't he just go back? Well, his dad is shoving him out the window to force Frederick to watch the execution of his childhood friend, Hans Hermann von Katte. From that point on, Frederick, the son, hardly ever spoke to his father. They were very silent, and you get the impression that he definitely intends to be a very different person from his father the day he's king. But for now, he's just quiet about it. We'll just have to wait and see what happens the day that he becomes king in Prussia. Frederick II the Great. First thing we need to say about Frederick II the Great is that he is considered one of the enlightened absolutists. That is, he takes a page from Louis XIV and has an absolute monarchy. He is the last authority. However, he's also enlightened and pretty much the first enlightened absolutist. What this means is that he basically tries to implement the Enlightenment philosophy, the philosophy of mainly the French part, Voltaire, mostly Voltaire. He's a huge fan of Voltaire, but other enlightened ideas such as tolerance, education of the citizens, things like that. Basic equality, although again he's absolutist. And I get basically his idea is that the best vehicle for this is absolutism. That absolutism is the best way to execute these enlightened ideals. You can even see that what Frederick called himself. He basically referred to himself as the first servant of the state. Yes, he's absolute, but his absoluteness is for service. He's the first servant of the state. That's kind of the favorite way he referred to himself. In some ways, it was reciprocated by his people. They had for him the nickname Old Fritz. Of course, that's later in his life. But also, he was hugely unpopular in some sectors as well. His popularity kind of rises high during the middle of his reign, but by the time he died, people were pretty much tired of him. But I get ahead of myself. Mainly, his reign began in 1740 A.D., that you might recognize as the same year that Maria Theresa began her reign in Austria. More on that later. 1740 AD he began his reign, and during his reign we can basically summarize his achievements under three main ideas: cultural, economic, and war. One page that Frederick the Great takes straight out of the page from Louis XIV is the building of a palace to basically be the center of his new life. A palace that is like Versailles, just as Versailles is about 20 miles southeast of Paris. Frederick the Great builds a place called Sanssouci. He builds the Palace of Sanssouci, which is actually French. You notice Frederick is obsessed with French. It's French for without a care. And it was built in Potsdam. Some of you may have heard of Potsdam. You heard about the Potsdam Conference last year in American history. Potsdam is about 20 miles southeast of Berlin. It was kind of a place for retreat, a place for Frederick to go to. His original purpose for it was to be a residence for Voltaire. This is actually Voltaire himself. This is Frederick the Great paying a visit to the sickly Voltaire. Voltaire eventually took him up on the offer and did live in Sanssouci for about 3 years, but not very much. Voltaire would regularly visit Frederick. But you get the idea, this grandioseness. For example, here's the concert hall down here. These are various pictures of the exterior. And in that concert hall, Frederick himself would retire, personally very often, and would himself play music to entertain his guests, as you can see in this picture right here. So one thing, the building of Sanssouci, using the architect von Knobelsdorff to build not only Sanssouci, but several very modern buildings in Berlin and in Potsdam. One thing that I might like to mention in this regard is the witty letters and various jokes between Voltaire and Frederick II. Remember, Frederick II was pretty accomplished in French, and there's a story told that one time he sent a letter to Voltaire that contained a picture of two hands over the letter P, then the letter A, and then the number 100 under the letter C. And then Voltaire responded with a letter that said J.A. Now, this was actually a French pun. Basically, this one said demain, meaning literally two hands, but it's pronounced demain. Souper, in other words, dine tomorrow at Sanssouci. The word for son in French is 100, but it sounds like son. Sous means under, Sanssouci. And then Voltaire's response meant j'ai grand appétit. In other words, I have a big appetite, but that's because it says j'ai grand, in other words, a big J, and a small a, appétit. So j'ai grand appétit. It was all a joke. If you didn't get that, I'm sorry. If you did get that, especially French students, then I hope you were delighted. The other major project that Frederick had was economic reform. Prussia's population is not very high, and the reason its population is not very high is because it has awful land, especially in Brandenburg. If you take a look right here, remember, if you recall before, Brandenburg was basically considered the sandbox of the Holy Roman Empire. But basically, Frederick wants to fix that. He wants to somehow make Prussia have a viable, self-sustaining economy. So he undertakes several drainage projects, several projects of reclaiming land, several of the opposite, irrigation projects, etc., all to make the land more fertile. That's the basic point, to make the land more fertile. And he did this personally. As first servant of the state, he had a real solicitude for farming, for making sure that Prussia was self-sustaining. So, for instance, a famous picture is this one right here, Frederick the Great inspecting the potato crops. By doing this kind of thing, he really made some people think that he had a real solicitude for their welfare. He's personally inspecting the potato crops here in a certain part of Brandenburg. Of course, some people just saw this as a little bit too controlling. But the main thing is this, it worked. He does boost the Prussian economy, or the Brandenburgian economy. We're going to call it Prussia now because we're in the Kingdom of Prussia. He boosts the Prussian economy in this way. However, if he's going to complete this, he needs to do one more thing. It's not enough just to work on what Prussia already has. They need new territory. The territory in particular that Frederick has in mind is the territory surrounding the Oder River, Silesia. You can even see right here, Schlesien. He wants Silesia because this is an area rich in resources and pretty high in population. If Frederick were able to get this territory, he would solve a lot of his problems of trying to make Prussia an economic powerhouse. So he decides to just take it. Essentially, he takes advantage of the woman who is on the throne of Austria-Hungary. That woman, of course, is none other than Maria Theresa Habsburg. She had gained the right to be the Habsburg heir through the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. You might remember that, the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. I like this particular picture because it shows all of her crowns. Only a couple I recognize. I recognize this one right here, back here, is the crown of Hungary. And I'm just guessing that this one is probably the crown of Austria, but I really don't know. The main one is the crown of Hungary, but it shows all her crowns, and so I just like that particular picture. Now, Prussia had also signed on the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, but Frederick simply breaks his promise. He just decides that, you'll see one thing, Frederick is ruthless. He will pursue his ends by any means, or ruthless isn't the word. Basically, he has no scruples whatsoever. He just seizes Silesia, as you can see right here. Now, this, of course, starts, not only does he do that, but he also coaxes France to attack Habsburg territory in the west, so in order to effectively distract the Austrian Empire, the Austrian holdings on two fronts. Austria needs help in this war, so basically Austria allies with England. So basically, in this war altogether, it's a war we've talked about before. It's the War of the Austrian Succession, begins right away in 1740. Both Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa are just new monarchs of their respective realms at this time. You basically have a war of France and Prussia versus Britain and Austria. The war itself lasts until 1748 with the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, and basically the terms are Prussia essentially wins. They get to keep Silesia. Prussia wins 1748. Now, of course, however, Maria Theresa is not going to be happy about this. Basically, in 1756, Maria Theresa undergoes what's called the diplomatic revolution. This is important. What happens is basically all the alliances change in Europe. She wants to get back Silesia, but she doesn't trust the British anymore. The British really didn't do a lot of work in the War of the Austrian Succession. They didn't send many personal troops. They sent some money, but also in the terms afterwards, they just didn't fight. They didn't go to bat for Maria Theresa very much. They didn't get her much out of the treaty. They basically just handed over everything to Frederick. So she just doesn't trust the British. So Maria Theresa doesn't trust the British. So she wants to change the alliance. She allies with France now, which also just is better in general because France, after all, is Catholic. So she would rather ally with them. She's a very pious person, as I mentioned before. So she allies with France, and she just doesn't trust the British. However, this suits the British just fine, because the British also make an alliance with Prussia. The reason the British make an alliance with Prussia is you got to remember why Britain even cares at this point about continental wars. Remember this, Britain right now is in the House of Hanover. Hanover is in Germany. The British kings want to protect their land in Germany, Hanover right here. It used to be, basically they want to ally with the strongest power in the central part of Europe. At first, that seemed to be Austria. As a matter of fact, the Habsburgs have always been powerful. But now, Prussia seems to be the most powerful. So Britain just decides to switch its alliance and ally with Protestant Prussia. It's also Protestant, but that honestly is not really an issue at this point. It's just powerful. It seems to be the most powerful force in Europe at this time. Now, when Frederick finds out about the alliance between Austria and France, Frederick takes a preemptive strike. He thinks that Maria Theresa is coming for Silesia, and he's basically right. So Frederick decides to strike first. Frederick preemptively strikes at Austria by invading Saxony. He preemptively invades Saxony. It's kind of an old rivalry between Saxony and Bavaria. And that basically offends the Habsburgs, and essentially this starts a whole new war. One of the most important wars of the 18th century, the 7 Years' War. This begins in the year 1756, the year of the same year as the diplomatic revolution, begins the 7 Years' War. It's going to be 1756 to 1763. In this particular map, you can see all the allied sides in this war. France is allied with Austria and Hungary. Spain is allied with France because Spain and France, remember, are both Bourbon at this point. So you see why that's the case. Portugal allies with Great Britain as well because Portugal hates Spain right now. So Portugal is going to ally with Great Britain, and Great Britain's already allied with Prussia. Russia eventually joins in with Austria because Russia's also very wary of the new power of Prussia. So basically you see the alliances here, and you basically see the European theater. Now the war as it begins ends up being bad for Prussia. At first, it doesn't quite work out for Prussia. It's not good for Prussia and Britain at first, especially for Prussia. As a matter of fact, Berlin was sacked twice during the early part of the war. So Frederick realizes he has to do something. Basically, Frederick takes a page right out of his dad's own book. He puts full emphasis on the army. He already basically inherited his father's army. You might recall his childhood seemed to show no interest in the army. But now he proves everybody wrong. He uses his father's army to his own advantage, and he becomes known for his hands-on approach to the army. He leads personally in battle. He spends the night with them in the camps. He became Old Fritz and turned them into the greatest infantry ever. Of course, another thing that he does is he increases the size of the army. He basically increases it to 200,000 troops. The fourth largest army in Europe at the time. That's a big deal. This tiny little country has now got the fourth largest army in Europe, 200,000. That's up from his father. His father only brought up to 80,000. People are very appreciative. He becomes well known for, he spends his whole life in this Prussian uniform. All the pictures of him in his old age show him in the Prussian blue, as you can see right here in this picture. He also, by the way, discovered the power of using music in the army, which is something that he added to his drills, and that helped make the Prussian army extremely effective. Basically, the summary is, he pours all he has into the army. He pours all his energy into the army. Which is something that no one expected. It's a complete turnaround from his childhood. And as we'll see, it ultimately pays off. In the European part of the war, Prussia and Britain won. And what that means is essentially nothing. All it really means is that Frederick kept Silesia. Prussia and Britain won. Frederick the Great kept Silesia for himself, which again he needs. He needs to have his Silesia for his big plans. Now you'll notice I said that Frederick won in the European theater. Single-handed, really, practically. The British honestly didn't help much in Europe. But that's because one other thing you have to realize is that the 7 Years' War was basically the largest world war up to that time. It was the largest world war. In America, for instance, it was known as the French and Indian War. That's important. You all probably have heard of the French and Indian War from American history. That is, even though the war started in Europe, Britain used it as a chance to get back at the French, who are their enemies on both Europe and elsewhere, in America. You can see it on this map. Prussia's winning all the battles in Europe, but Britain is winning all the battles outside of Europe. Here in North America, these red circles represent British victories over the French, and the blue ones represent French victories. Same thing in the Caribbean, same thing in India, and this map doesn't even show it, but also in West Africa. That's literally all the places the war was being fought. The 7 Years' War was in Europe, it was in North America, it was in the Caribbean, it was in India. In the end, the British won everywhere, and the French are going to have to pay out huge portions of their territory. In the end, the British end up having to hand over all of Canada and all of North of United States up to the Mississippi River to the British. They also hand over basically everything in the Caribbean, and the French also have to pull out of India. So you basically get the idea. It was a massive war. 1 million people died altogether, all over the various, all over all of the theaters. 1 million people died total. Another thing you should know about this war is it sets the stage for the British Empire, the Second British Empire. Now, that might sound ironic because one thing it does is it's extremely expensive. And as you know, the British are going to want to try to pay for this war after they won it. Well, the war was fought for the advantage of the colonies of North America. So what do they do to pay for this war afterwards? Well, they basically asked the colonies of North America to foot the bill with some heavy taxes. And of course, that will start the American Revolution about 13 years later. 13 years later, they will lose eventually, 1781, 13 years the war begins, but the American Revolution, they will lose their North American colonies. However, in this same war, they gained India, and that's because of this man right here, Robert Clive, from the East India Company. The war caused a lot of instability with the Mughals of India, and these Mughals basically had an uprising, and in the gap went Robert Clive, who literally actually works for the East India Company. He's not actually a government official, but he has his own military, and basically the East India Company, the British East India Company, a private corporation, ends up taking over India, and this is basically how Britain gets India. So even though they lose North America ultimately as a result of this war, they gain huge parts of other areas, Canada, etc., the Caribbean, but they're also gaining India. And I didn't show you this picture, but here's a picture of the French and Indian War itself. So this was quite a war, and it all starts because Frederick invades Saxony preemptively. Something ironic. Frederick invades Saxony, and therefore Britain loses eventually North America and gains India. Now, after the war of the 7 Years' War was over, Frederick now has one of the main things he wanted. He's got Prussia and he's got Silesia, claimed now twice by 2 wars. Then suddenly something else comes to the fore. Catherine the Great of Russia is now the Empress of Russia, the Tsarina, and she begins to invade Ottoman territory. She begins to invade the territory of the Ottoman Turks. This is Sultan Murad III. He's the Sultan at the time. And as you can see, he's just not too happy about all this. And he loses. Catherine actually makes several gains into the territory of... just give me 1 second here. Yes, Sebastian, I'll do it in a second. Let me just finish this. Into the Crimea. She gains the Crimea and things like that. Maria Theresa, who's also still alive, also begins to think she should start to take some turf from the Ottoman Empire. Now, this worries Frederick. Frederick is worried about the balance of power. There he is, still kind of a small country right here, and he doesn't want Russia and Austria, the other two absolutist monarchies in Central Europe, to become very powerful. So he decides he wants to distract them from their designs on taking Ottoman Turk territory. So he decides a way to distract them is Poland. There's Poland in between. If he can get them to focus on Poland instead, then maybe he can distract them from taking Ottoman territory, and maybe he can get something out of the deal. So he begins to focus his energies on Poland. This was actually a great idea considered from Frederick's point of view because unfortunately Poland, which is really Poland-Lithuania, is a very weak country at this time. This is mainly because, whether they knew it or not, they probably made a mistake in 1569 at the Union of Lublin. The Union of Lublin is kind of like the Act of Union back in Britain. Basically, Poland and Lithuania have already had a personal union of their monarch ever since 1386 or so. But in 1569, the last Jagiellonian king declared the Union of Lublin, which basically decided that now there would be one Sejm. Sejm is basically parliament, but in Polish they call it the Sejm, that would rule both Poland and Lithuania, and that the Sejm would now run an elective monarchy. That is, they would elect their kings instead of pass them down by succession. You can see on that next slide, what they would do is, when one king died, they would elect the next king in a large camp outside Warsaw. You can see it right here. Here's one of the elections right here in this painting by Jan Matejko. And actually, this election is interesting because the king they elected is Henry III, as in Henry III Valois, the last Valois king of France, the one before Henry IV of Navarre, the one we talked about before. Now, not only that, but they had certain other privileges. The other privileges that they eventually insisted on in the Sejm was that in the Sejm, the nobles, all nobles were equal. All nobles were equal in the Sejm. But not only that, every noble had the power of veto. Every noble could veto. Now, this was actually very bad for the stability of Poland because when any noble saw his interests being infringed upon by a proposed law, he just vetoed it, which meant a lot of necessary reforms would not happen in Poland because the nobles are thinking mostly of themselves. Not only that, but they limit the king. They'll limit the king quite a bit. For example, they eventually passed a resolution that the king needs to lessen his army. Mainly, the problem was this. They were so fed up. Well, let me just go to the next slide. That might make it easier. They were so fed up with the cost of the Great Turkish War. You might remember the Great Turkish War. That's the one where Jan Sobieski fought the Turks at Vienna. They lost so many men. The nobles were so fed up. The Sejm, I'll put it that way, the Sejm was so fed up with the expense of the Great Turkish War that the Sejm eventually limited the army of Poland to only 24,000 troops. Yes, 24,000. They limited the army to 24,000 troops. If you remember, Frederick the Great just increased his Prussian army to 200,000. And now the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that's what it's called, by the way, it's now called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, has limited its army to 24,000. This is going to be a disaster. So basically, they're ripe for the picking. There's another problem. Even though Poland is rich in natural resources, they're no longer being used. No one's buying from them anymore. And that's because all the great powers in Europe are just using their colonies to get cheap natural resources. So Poland's economy is tanking too. That's another thing worth mentioning. Their economy is tanking. This place rich in resources that nobody's buying. But then there's a final reason why their economy's tanking. Basically, Frederick the Great wants to weaken Poland so that he can distract Catherine the Great of Russia and Maria Theresa of Hungary. So he does something particularly devious. He basically manages to sneak into Poland and to steal a bunch of mint dies, and he brings them to Prussia, and he starts to mint a lot of counterfeit coins. Here's a coin showing the sting, Stanislaw Poniatowski. Here's some other Polish coins, actual Polish coins from the time. And basically what he did was he took those coins and he started to flood the Polish economy with counterfeit money. This, of course, caused rampant, basically he saturated the market, and the value of the Polish currency basically just dropped, and even more their economy tanked. So you got a country now, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with basically rampant inflation, currency's been devalued, the army's only up to 24,000, and the king can really do nothing about it. It's at this point now that Frederick makes his move. Once Frederick has the weakness of Poland in place, he basically says, hey ladies, why don't we all take a piece of Poland instead of you fighting the Ottoman Turks? Okay, he doesn't say that second part out loud, but they say, let's all just take a piece of Poland. For really not any reason that I can think of. I can tell you one thing. What Frederick really wants is this. He wants West Prussia. He wants to join his Brandenburg and Silesian holdings with Prussia. But basically, and the idea works. Catherine the Great is game. She's like, yeah, sure, I'll take a huge piece of Poland. I would love a piece of Poland. Maria Theresa regrets it. She basically feels bad about it, but she also says yes. Thus, you have kind of one of the most cynical things that happens in the 18th century. These powers just decide to partition Poland. This is known as, well, that is known as the First Partition of Poland. First Partition of Poland, which takes place in the year 1772. You have a picture here of the great powers. It's something that was cartooned, or a lot of cartoons were made about at the time. Here you have Frederick the Great. He's taking his part. Then you have Joseph II. He's taking his part for his mom, on behalf of his mom. And if you notice, he's looking away, because remember, Maria Theresa regretfully did it, but she still did it, so he's taking his part. Here's the king of Poland, Stanislaw Bummer, I can never remember how to pronounce his last name, Poniatowski or something like that. And he's basically he basically acts like he's fine with it, and that's mainly because of Catherine. Catherine here is also taking a piece. You notice she's looking at Stanislaw because these two were lovers once. They actually were lovers a while ago, so you can kind of see the reason for the influence here. The King of Poland is just going along with it. Remember, the King of Poland doesn't have much power. As I said, it was a thing that was often documented in political cartoons of the day, and here's a particularly interesting one from America. This one shows the Ottoman Sultan bound in chains, because you remember he's the sick man of Europe at this time. Here's Stanislaw Poniatowski, the King of Poland. He's also bound. There's Catherine the Great. Here is Joseph II. You can tell it's Joseph II because his crown kind of looks like a mitre, so it's the association with the Holy Roman Empire, because he is by this point also Holy Roman Emperor. And then also you have Frederick the Great right here. You have the King of France looking on very concerned. You can tell it's the King of France because he's got the fleur-de-lis, and you have the King of Spain as well, so you're two Bourbons. But then you have the King of Britain, George III, sorry, this is George III by this point, who just doesn't care and is falling asleep. Basically, Britain is losing interest in the continent at this point, and the Hanovers are putting more stock in their colonies in the New World, which they're about to lose, rather than in continental happenings. Now, of course, you might be thinking, why is Poland letting this happen? Well, for one thing, as I mentioned, Poland is weak. But the other thing is they don't really know they're weak. The Sejm actually signs off. Here's a picture, a dramatic picture of the Sejm, saying that they basically agreed that, yes, this is probably good for Poland. It's good for it to be partitioned like this among the three great powers. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. As I already mentioned, the Polish king, here he is again, Stanislaw Poniatowski, is a former lover of Catherine the Great. But also, they were forced into it. You can see right here, you can see some Prussian troops guarding the door. And that's true. The Russians were there, the Prussians were there. You can even see a portrait of Catherine the Great way up here. They're basically forced the Sejm to agree. There were some heroes like Tadeusz Rejton here who literally said, "over my dead body." And so everybody just literally walked over his living body. He didn't die, although he later became insane because of all this and did die. But he was a hero. But otherwise, the Polish Sejm just signed off on this and allowed themselves to allowed huge chunks of their country to be given to the three great powers.
Over his body? Are you crazy?
No, they did. A few years later, they regretted this, and in the year 1791, they realized that it's their own fault that they were so weak, so they decided to reform and make a new constitution. Poland wrote a constitution, the first constitution written since the American Revolution, or since the American one, not the American Revolution, but since the American Constitution. That's one of Poland's distinctions. In doing so, they asked for the help of Prussia. They asked Prussia for help. At that point, by the way, Frederick the Great will be dead, so I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. But they asked Prussia for help because Prussia is known for its Enlightenment principles, and constitutions seem to be a very enlightened thing. However, when Catherine the Great heard that they were writing a constitution, she was furious. Catherine the Great, by this point, has basically renounced all her Enlightenment principles. She's had a lot of trouble with peasants in Russia, especially due to the Pugachev rebellion. So she's basically renounced all the Enlightenment principles she used to hold dear. She's renounced her correspondence with Voltaire. And she sees Poland now as following the way of the French Revolution. She can't stand the French Revolution. She hates all this Jacobinism. So she basically foments the nobles of Poland to resist this constitution. You see that in this picture right here. Here you have the heroes of the constitution right here, raising up the constitution itself, but you also see the nobles resisting, and you also see the king, once again, Stanislaw, not really caring. A great war ensues where Russian troops basically come in and fight against the peasants on the side of the nobles, and Russia wins. They basically quash the rebellion, and poor King Stanislaw has to once again, at the behest of his former lover, tell the Polish to renounce their constitution. Now, once they do, Frederick William II, the nephew of Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great, by the way, is dead by this point, and he had no sons because he really didn't love his wife. But Frederick William, his nephew, is now the King of Prussia, and he feels that he deserves something for not interfering with Catherine, even though the peasants of Poland, or the lower class of Poland, had come to him for help. He says, well, I didn't interfere, so we should get something out of this. So basically, Catherine and Frederick William agree to partition Poland again. So you have the second partition of Poland in 1793. 1793, they basically, Prussia and Russia divide Poland again. 1793, the second partition of Poland. They each take two bigger chunks of Poland. This one only involves two powers. Prussia and Russia. Now this is just too much for some Polish heroes to swallow, especially Tadeusz Kosciusko. Kosciusko is known for his revolutionary views. As a matter of fact, Kosciusko fought in the American Revolution. He literally went over to the United States to fight the British in the American Revolution, and he was the one who fortified West Point in the battle for West Point when they put the big chain across the water. That was him. It was his idea. But now he's returned to his native Poland, and he's furious about all these partitions. So he leads an uprising against the powers of Russia, mostly the power of Russia. That's who he's mainly mad at. So he leads a massive rebellion, the Kosciusko Uprising. You can see him here in this picture gathering troops. You can see how it attracted all walks of life. Here you have a woman in arms and another peasant man in arms. And you see a major battle right here. However, the Russian army's huge, and this uprising never had any hope. So, once again, Russia quashes this uprising, and once it does, Russia, Prussia, and Austria decide that Poland is just too much trouble. We basically should just wipe it off the map. And so what do? They have the third partition of Poland. The third partition in 1795. What does Kosciusko do? Well, Kosciusko returns to his beloved United States and lives in a small house in Philadelphia for the rest of his life, which is now a national monument. So thus, kind of the last legacy of Frederick the Great is starting this tendency to partition Poland that in a matter of 20 years will result in the entire country, the entire kingdom of Poland-Lithuania being wiped out. As you can see in this animation. Gone. A whole country gone. Of course, what lesson did the Europeans draw from this? Absolutism is the way to go. If you don't have an absolutist government, look how weak you are. No more Poland. You can also see the big increases here. Prussia's gotten quite bigger. It's more than doubled its land size, and I believe it's more than doubled its population. Russia's gained a lot of territory at the expense of Poland and the Ottoman Turks. The Habsburgs as well have gained a lot of territory from Poland mostly. So you get the basic point. There is our summary of the enlightened monarchs, Maria Theresa and Joseph II of Austria, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Frederick the Great of Prussia. The end.